everybody, welcome back to The Hobby Musician. You're joining us as we work our way through a mini-series where we are building a guitar from a kit. Now, if you want to get caught up on any of the previous episodes or you just want to see any phase of the build, go ahead and click the link at the top and that'll take you to a playlist with everything we've done. Now, today's episode is a little bit special because even though we're doing it to a guitar that isn't assembled yet, today's project is basically a maintenance step that you can perform on any instrument you either currently own or might get in the future. Today we're talking about fret leveling and crowning. To set this up a little bit about what that does or what we mean by that, if you take any guitar neck or bass neck and you look at all of the frets, you know that up and down the fingerboard, the frets are spaced out at the appropriate intervals. But if you look at it side on, we also know that the frets have a certain height. And one of the issues that can arise if the frets aren't leveled correctly is imagine if some of the frets are maybe a little bit higher or a little bit lower than the frets they're next to. What that can ultimately create is a situation where you're playing your instrument, and if you happen to fret a note behind, higher up on the neck than a fret down here that's too high, if the frets are not level with each other, if they're not the appropriate heights, I should say it that way, then you could be playing a note and way up here on the neck, you could have a high fret. And as the string is vibrating back and forth, that string could bump into the fret, causing fret buzz. Or if it's really bad, it can just mute and deaden the note entirely. So the process of leveling the frets is just a maintenance step that you can perform on a guitar you already have, or as we're going to do today, on a guitar that we're about to build. So the tools that you're going to need for this, you can see that I've already actually prepared this neck. I've taken blue painter's masking tape. You can use any kind of masking tape you've got. And I have very carefully taped off every single fret right up to the metal fret because I just want to protect the wood. We're going to be doing some sanding, some filing. I don't want to damage the wood here. So that's one thing that you're going to need. The other things that you're going to need, I like to use a notched straight edge, and you can see here tons of companies make these, so it's not any specific one that you need to get, and a lot of them come with different scale lengths. So if you have like a Fender style scale or a Gibson style scale, they'll come with different spacings. But what this allows you to do is the notches allow you to check the straightness. Oh, actually I need this way. They allow you to check the straightness of your guitar because they miss the frets, and all of these straight edges down here will go down and tell you if your neck is straight. We need the neck, the wood of the neck, to be straight before we start, because if there's any kind of bend or relief in the neck, that curve shape, even a little bit, when we have a curve shape in the neck and we come back with our sandpaper and we start to sand down the file, well, you think about it, the sandpaper is going to hit the frets at the top and the bottom, and if there's a curve in here, it's going to completely miss the ones in the middle, and that's going to defeat the purpose of getting all of the frets at the exact same height across the neck. So what I did before I started was I took this notched straight edge, and I'll put up some pictures here so you can see the start and the finish. But when I first unboxed this neck out of the kit, when it arrived, I checked the straightness. And you can see in the top picture, there is gaps. If you look all the way to the end of the neck, kind of on the left side, you'll see that the bottoms of those notches touch the wood. But as you start to go, in the higher frets, 3, 5, 7, you go down the neck, you start to see there's a little bit of a gap. So I took an Allen wrench and I adjusted the truss rod. I went in and I actually tightened the neck. I had to tighten the truss rod to stretch or straighten out that wood. And then in the bottom picture, you see that after I straightened it out, I checked and I did a little more and checked, always doing in small increments. You can see that after I was done, now every single one of those flat notched straight edge pieces is touching the board. So then when I came back, I knew that I had a straight neck to start with. So that was the first thing that we did to this. And as I said, you check that with the straight edge. Then what you can do to see whether or not the frets themselves are, not level to each other, you get a regular straight edge. So you can see here, this is just a regular straight edge. There's no notches in it. And knowing that the wood of the neck is straight, when I come back now, I can use this straight edge, and you can kind of get down here and look, and it's really hard to see on the camera, but when you look, you will also, if there are higher or lower frets, you will then visually see gaps. You'll see space underneath the straight edge that you're laying on top of the frets. And that's how you know that you're going to need to do this process today. So what I'm going to do then to get to actually do the work, I'm going to switch up the camera, get a nice close-up shot over here, and we'll be back at it and get to work on this. So hang tight. All right, we're all switched up here, and to get started with this project, as we said just a second ago, we've already prepared ourselves a little bit by getting all of this masking tape on here. The next thing that we're going to want to do is we actually have, I grabbed a couple of Sharpie markers, and the way that we're going to tell whether or not, when we come back with our sandpaper that you can see here on our straight edge, our sanding beam, we want to know if I drag that flat sandpaper across the frets back and forth, I need a way to be able to tell whether or not the sandpaper is hitting all of the frets equally. As we said before, the goal of this, we want to level the frets. We want to make sure that at some point, kind of all of the frets are starting out at an appropriate similar height. But I won't know unless there's a visual indicator. So that's where the Sharpies come in. When you check this out on YouTube, you see a lot of people doing, their own version of this. Well, what they do is you just take a Sharpie and you color down the tops of all of the frets. And so I'm just putting a mark. Definitely, I'm not covering the entire curved surface of the fret, but I am getting the very top of all of the frets, so that, as I said a second ago, we're going to drag what we know to be a straight beam with sandpaper on it across all the frets. And if there are frets that are higher than the frets next to them, we'll be able to see the Sharpie mark get ground off the top frets, but it will remain on the frets below it. And when it remains on the frets, we know that, they're being blocked or kind of, protected, I guess if you want to think of it that way, by the frets next to them. And so that's why they're not getting ground off. And we don't want to grind the frets down to nothing because we still need them, right? Frets don't work if they're flattened down to the fingerboard. So we're not talking about taking off tons and tons of material. Our goal is simply to sand or grind or file, whatever term you like better. We want to simply grind down until we see that every fret up and down the neck is at least getting touched by the sandpaper. And we know the sandpaper's on a level beam, so if every fret is getting touched by the sandpaper, then every fret is at least at the same level. So that's why we have the Sharpie marker here. And I'll just talk a little bit. I happen to be using a Fret Guru sanding beam. They're not a sponsor of the channel. It just happens to be the beam that I have. I keep calling it a beam. If you're at home, all you need is a straight edge. If you have a different straight edge, you can maybe get some sandpaper with an adhesive back and you can stick it onto that straight edge. It doesn't have to be a specialized tool. It can be a piece of wood. It can just be a little beam of wood that you check and make sure you get a straight edge, and you check the wood to make sure the wood is straight. That's the only thing that matters. You just need a straight surface with some grit. Some people use files. If you check and make sure that your file is very straight, that'll work too. The last thing I'll say before we get started, some folks will point out that fingerboards and frets also have a radius. So when you look at, the different instrument manufacturers, they will talk about the different curvatures of their necks. So yes, using a straight edge like we're going to use today does not have the curvature. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to pay attention. I'm going to try to move across or around the frets this way, back and forth, so that as I'm taking a straight path and I'll move to the middle and I'll move to the side, I want to make sure that I'm at least doing my best not to demolish the curvature. So I don't want to just go in the middle, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and then wear that down without doing anything on the side. So we're just going to be careful, and it really does work just as well as, you know, some of these specialized blocks where the surface is not flat, it's actually at different curvatures, and you can put sandpaper on there. So to get our first pass here, I'm going to start kind of on this outside edge, and I'm going to come and, like I said, the point of this is I'm going to hold this and I've got my hand underneath it so I can kind of keep the neck in place, and I'm going to just take a pass down the sides all the way down and all the way back up. And now I'm going to just take a minute. I'm going to try to see if I can zoom in or if you can see it. I can see right here, so I think this is the 4th fret, there's a lot of that mark got taken off. But if I look down here, here's 2 frets that really didn't have any of the Sharpie taken off at all. And then the one right next to it has almost all the Sharpie taken off. And looking down here, here's another one with all the Sharpie taken off. And here are some other ones with the marks still there. This is what we're talking about. We know that the level, this surface was straight. So what that tells me is some of these frets are higher than others, and they're not allowing the beam to touch the fret. And so that's what we want to do. We want to work our way across the entire fret. I'm going to come next to them, kind of closer to the middle, and take another pass up and down, trying to make sure. So you, like if you're worried about it, you can try to make sure that you're level, you know, kind of going up and down, back and forth. And I'm going to move over past the middle, kind of coming to this other side, and then all the way over here on the edge. And you can see that as I go, there are areas. So we've kind of gone across it here, and definitely some of those frets that we saw initially, I'm looking right here. Here's a good example. The edges, the corners of this fret were high, but the middle was low, because right next to it on either side, I see grinding marks on the frets, but there's nothing in the middle of this one. So this is the process of leveling out those frets, and you just go back and forth gently and carefully across the whole neck until you got that. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to keep working. I'm going to kind of do this, kind of gently check it, and then I'll be back and we'll talk about this process when we kind of get it all finished. So I'll switch over to a time lapse now, and then we'll be back in a second to talk about it. All right, everybody, we are back, and we are actually done with the leveling process. Now, as you probably could tell in that time lapse, it took a bunch of passes up and down the neck to achieve what we were talking about, to achieve this situation where you can look at all of the marks and you can finally see the scraping or the shiny scrapes finally hitting every part of the surface of every fret. Now, even as I'm talking right now, you may notice some of the frets look like more or less of the Sharpie was worn off of them, and that's because some of these frets were higher and lower. For example, if I come up here, some of these frets kind of closer, in the 5-6 range, it took a lot of the top of the frets off here. But if you look down here, I don't know, this is somewhere in the 8 or 9, fret 8 or 9 range, you can still see there's some black right there in the middle. But This was the single most problematic fret. As I was going, I could tell and I could see that the Sharpie was being ground off of everything else except this fret. And I would go pass after pass and it would still be there, which told me this was lower. And if I don't address it now, after I put this whole thing together, I'm going to get some fret buzz, because if I were to play this fret and it's lower than everything after, I'm going to get some fret buzz on my string. So I continue to do pass after pass after pass until, it may be hard to see on the camera, I could see there are just the beginnings of scrapings right in that middle. So I know now the beam it had finally worn down and was able to get that fret. And I checked all of them, and there's little scrapings everywhere on the frets. So the leveling process is now complete, but you'll also start to think to yourself, wait a minute, some of these frets he just showed us are almost now, they're like tabletops. They're like flat tabletops. So if I were to play the strings, I've got this flat space, and is it going to be on the back corner or the front corner? And that's where the second part of the process. Typically, when you hear people talk about this process, they'll say it's fret leveling and crowning. And what that refers to is, we know that the frets are now kind of have these little tabletops on top of them. So we want to put them back to a curved, or at least more curved, sometimes more pointy top, so that there's a single point that the strings will touch when you're playing the instrument. And that's where a crowning file comes in. When you talk about a crowning file, what that means is it's not a file in the sense where the flat part has any grit or teeth. It's actually on the edges of a crowning file. They are curved, they're concave curved in, and the filing edge is actually inside here. So you can come down on top of a fret like this and file it down, and because the inside is concave, if a curve, you can take a flat top and you can grind it back to a curve. And you may be asking yourself, how are we going to be able to tell when we've done enough, or what if we do too much? That's where a Sharpie marker comes in. For a second time, we are going to mark the tops of all of these. But to just demonstrate it for one, I'm going to pick one of these that really took a lot off the frets. So like I said, in the 4 to 5 fret range, these really took a lot off. So I'm going to remark the top of this fret. And in fact, it took so much off that I can actually feel a physical difference when I'm drawing this mark. When I did it the first time, they were all smooth and kind of round, and it just kind of, but there's actually grooves in it now that take, and it actually resists the Sharpie. So you can see I've got a mark back on there. And what this fret crowning file will do, as I said before, if I come back and I come down on the top of this, if I now grind back and forth, and I'm doing a very subtle rocking motion. I'm trying to rock back and forth so that I'm getting the back side of this and following the curvature. You know, I'm not just doing it flat and then back and forth, back and forth. I'm trying to kind of rock to follow the curvature of the fretboard. If I do that, what I will then accomplish is I can feel it grinding. So it is actually now grinding the edges of that top flat thing back closer to the middle. And by having the Sharpie mark there, I can watch the Sharpie mark disappear, and in an exact reverse of our first step, I actually want all of the Sharpie mark to go away except for a very thin line right across the top. So I'm going to keep doing this until I get that very, very thin Sharpie mark right on the top of the fret. And that way I know I have ground down the edges or the sides, and you can see it's getting shiny. It's getting shiny again on the sides. It's going to come closer and closer, and I get a thin Sharpie mark back on the top. Then I know I've crowned and I've put back the curve on top of the fret, but the very top of the fret will be at the level that we created in our previous step. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to now, once again, I'll switch over to the time lapse and you'll see me do that for all the frets. But that is the process of crowning your frets after you've leveled them all. So, okay, I'll switch back over and we'll be back in a second to talk about the final steps of this process. All right, there you have it. We have just finished crowning all of the frets. And like we were talking about, I was using the crowning file until I got to the point where I could start to see, when I would check it, I would file for a little bit and then I would check it and I would start to see the shiny parts on both sides of our Sharpie mark. And then I would see them get thinner and thinner until I was left with a very thin Sharpie mark across the tops. And that's how I knew that I was taking that flat edge and I was taking the corners of the flat edge into more of a point so that we get back to our rounded fret that we want as the finished product. Now, a couple notes. You remember we were talking about some of these frets being kind of higher or lower. The thing to keep in mind, even when you're doing this, realize that you're not necessarily going to have the same visual effect for every single fret. For example, the frets up here that I talked about having a lot of material that was taken away, they were very, very flat. So when you use a crowning file, you're going to get a very stark difference. You're going to see that shine from the two sides, the two edges of the crown really start to visually show up, and you're going to be left with this hard, crystal clear Sharpie line. On the contrast, if you come up to some of these, one of the things you'll notice is for frets that didn't have a lot of material taken off, well then consider they wouldn't have been very flat. They wouldn't have had a very flat top when you begin to use the crown. So they would have already been mostly curved with just a touch. Well, think about it. This is curved. So if you take a curved filing surface on a relatively curved fret, you're going to see, when you do a little bit of filing and you check it, you're actually going to see the Sharpie mark pretty much start to disappear all over the place. And that's one little pro tip that I want to give you is be careful. Don't necessarily, if you start to see the Sharpie mark disappear everywhere, what that's telling you is that the fret you're working on probably was already pretty curved before you started using a curved file. Down here, they were very flat, so I could see a night and day difference. But up here, I started to see some of these frets. I did a couple passes with the crowning file, and it was taking off Sharpie from everywhere, so I stopped. So that's the end of the crowning process and the very last thing that we want to do. There's still Sharpie marks everywhere, and if you get really close to this, it's hard to see on camera, but you will see there are just the marks of sanding and filing. These are metal, the file is metal. Now obviously it was sandpaper on the leveling beam. But when you take coarse metal or coarse sandpaper, you're going to get kind of noticeable visible scratches in the frets. We don't want that as the finished product. We don't want Sharpie marks on here, and we want smooth, almost mirror finish on these frets. And the last thing that we're going to use some of these sanding emery boards. These particular ones I got at StewMag, and they're not sponsors either, but they just happen to be very convenient. What they are is a series of different grits of sandpaper, and I forget off the top of my head specifically what grits they are, but they've made them so that it's the 3 grits you need to basically finish off and completely polish. The black side is the most coarse, then on the other half is about a medium in terms of the 3 grits. So this is the coarsest grit, this is the medium grit, and then the entire backside is a very fine grit, so that you can come back and essentially you start and you just grind, or not grind, you sand and polish. It's on a foam backing, so you can actually really easily rotate it all the way around. And when you rotate it all the way around, you're just polishing off any remaining Sharpie mark, and you're very gently grinding out and polishing out the grit and the scratches from the filing and the sanding beam. So that's what we're going to do now. Every single fret I'm going to polish with the coarse, then the medium, and then I'm going to flip it over and polish it with the fine. And when I'm done, all of the Sharpie marks are going to be gone, and all of the frets are going to have just a pure, smooth mirror finish. So that's what's coming up next. So one more time lapse, and then we'll come back and finish up this episode. So hang tight. Well, folks, there you have it. We are all done. As you saw in that last time lapse, we just used our emery boards with the 3 different grits of sandpaper to basically take off the Sharpie and just put a gorgeous polished shine on these. And you can kind of see it on camera right now, but I'll make sure that I put up a close-up as we're talking about it. But yeah, that's the last step. We went through from start to finish. We made sure that our neck was straight before we started the process, and that's what we used our notch straight edge for. We adjusted the truss rod to make sure that the wood and everything on the neck was flat. Then when we came back with our sanding board, a flat sanding board, we saw that any frets that were higher or lower got knocked down or sanded down at different levels depending on how high or low they were. The very last step then was to come back with our crowning file, and any of those frets that really had severely been sanded down and had those super flat tops, the crowning file came back in and sanded or ground off the edges to give us back a top of a fret that's nice and rounded. And as we said just a second ago, we still had some little remnants of Sharpie marks and some ground, some of those scratches from the different files and sanding paper that we used. So we made sure that our little emery boards came back, took off the Sharpie marks, and gave us back a polished mirror shine. So we have completed that project. And as we said at the very top of the episode, this isn't limited to folks who are building a guitar or putting one together from a kit. This is something that you can do. This is a maintenance step if you ever have one of your own instruments that is experiencing maybe some fret buzz, or maybe it's just been a long time and the strings themselves are starting to dig in and wear down the frets. You can take the strings off, follow these steps, and get yourself back to a nice, great starting point for your guitar neck. So I hope you got something out of the episode. I thank you for watching, and as always, until next time, play on, my friends, play on.